So what I'd like to do is begin the way we have the first two sessions, and that is just begin with a brief period of prayer that just involves letting go of some of the words of this brief passage from the Psalms. So let's be still for a few moments. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Amen.
You can get this. You can get this because great.
What I'd like to do today is, before we actually get into the content, I've tried to mention in the first two sessions a couple of points. One is I guess the question, why now? Why the interest in mindfulness right now in the Christian tradition? And the second question, which I tried to speak to last week, is that we have a wonderful historical rich tradition of mindfulness under other names in the Christian tradition. But in some ways, it's sort of a hidden gem within particularly the non-Catholic and non-Eastern Orthodox religious traditions. And I've drawn a lot on the book Right Here, Right Now by Amy Oden. And I thought I'd like to show a brief segment, excuse me, of a conversation between Amy Oden and the senior pastor of a large United Methodist church in Birmingham that they carried on by Zoom last month. Amy Oden, I think, as I've mentioned, is on the faculty of a Methodist seminary in Oklahoma City. And I'd like to show just the first 7 minutes of this video, in which she kind of addresses those two questions: why now, and why is this in some ways not more widely known outside of the Catholic tradition? So this was a Zoom interview, so if it goes well, we will be on a Zoom meeting, watching a Zoom meeting, which is interesting. So we'll see.
I'm thankful today to have a special guest that I'll be interviewing today relative to our book, Right Here, Right Now, that we've been studying throughout Lent. And what an awesome and timely book it is. I can't imagine anything that would be more timely for us as believers, for our nation, for our world, than looking at and deeply exploring Christian mindfulness. It is a treat to have with us someone who can take us the next leg of the journey. Dr. Amy Oden, the writer of this, and someone I'm lucky enough to call a good friend. Let's learn from Dr. Oden now.
Can you hear?
Yes.
I'm so excited to be here with Amy Oden, Professor Amy Oden, who is the author of the book that we've been studying, Right Here, Right Now. And she is a huge blessing, not only to her students, but also as a spiritual director to a number of believers and as a faculty member of the Academy for Spiritual Formation. And that's where I got to know her and have been blessed by her in many ways. And so first of all, I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks. It's a treat to get to be here.
So we're talking about the book Right Here, Right Now, and a little background. We've been studying this throughout Lent, and not only have I been preaching sermons inspired by it, but our small groups have been studying it. And we had several of the small groups say, we got to get her to come to Grace. And then this whole infection thing happened, and obviously something that we nor God wanted to happen. However, from a redemptive standpoint, some ministry opportunities have revealed themselves to us, because I never ever would have thought of, well, hey, we'll just bring her through Zoom and she won't have to leave her home in Oklahoma. So that's how we ended up here today. And I wanted to start just by asking you, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, thanks for asking, because it's been really amazing to me that this book on mindfulness is speaking into this moment, right, with the pandemic. But that's not, I wrote it 3.5, almost 4 years ago now. So I wrote it when a whole different kind of set of realities were going on. And it really, in some ways, I feel like God is able to use this scholarship now in even a new way. At the time, there were really three main things, because I want my scholarship to help the body of Christ. And so as I looked around in the world, I saw reactivity and cycles of reactivity skyrocketing, not only through social media, but political polarization, where, one person says one thing and another person escalates it and reacts. So cycles of reactivity mean we're not really free to hear God's voice. We're reacting to whatever headline caught our attention. So reactivity. The second thing reason I wrote this book is because I saw the pace of our lives, and especially with young families, and I heard from so many young parents, just the frenzied pace and the overstimulation of folks who felt like, I don't know whose life I'm leading. I'm just going to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, but I'm not even living my own, I'm not present to my own life. That's not abundant life. And then thirdly, at the same time, in all of this, mindfulness was exploding in the culture, in therapist's office, in yoga, in factory workers and assembly lines. So all these different places, mindfulness is showing up, and it's a proven strategy to deal with reactivity and frenzied lives, and it's part of our Christian spiritual tradition. And so I wanted to connect all those dots because God offers us abundant life, and I think mindfulness is one of the really helpful practices for that.
Historically, I know, and I resonate with what you said about this being part of our tradition. Although, had I not gone to seminary, I wouldn't have known that this was part. I would have thought, man, that's something that Catholics do, or Buddhists do, or New Age thing. And could you say a word about why Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, why we don't know anything about this, why we're so ignorant of this being a part of our tradition?
Yeah, there's a lot of historical reasons for that. Part of it is that as Protestants, so for the last 500 years, Protestants have really been, in many ways, a little bit suspicious of all spiritual practices, because what Protestants spent several hundred years doing was kind of differentiating ourselves from Catholics. So if anything looked Catholic, even if it's a really useful biblical practice, then Protestants didn't want to do it, just as a way of sort of having an identity that was distinctive. But I think the other piece is that, particularly again in America and among Protestants, we've often thought of prayer as the only kind of prayer that counts is kind of spontaneous prayer spoken by an individual out of a particular, moment. And that's an important way to pray. We need that way to pray because we can pour our heart out to God. but we've kind of limited ourselves to thinking that's the only way to pray. And certainly that's not what Jesus tells us about prayer. And that's not what tradition tells us about prayer. So in a lot of ways, you're right. If you hadn't been, most Christians aren't aware of this, but the good news is we can be aware now. And our tradition is just full of wonderful resources.
Well, I appreciate that because
I'm going to stop there. Her interview is 29 minutes long. If you're interested in the rest of it, this is sort of a teaser, I guess. If you're interested in the rest of her interview, you can look online for Grace United Methodist Church, Birmingham, Alabama. Go to their website. They have a menu item entitled Videos. Pull it down, and this video is front and center. So if you're interested, you may want to do that. Before we go on,
had it not been for the
bear with me, folks. Okay. Before we go on, does anyone have comments or thoughts about what you've just seen, either verbally, or you can send Jenny a chat message? Okay. Jenny, I'm seeing you shrug, so I take it that that means we'll go on then. Okay, so very good. Just a reminder from the last two times, and Amy Oden mentioned this. This is her definition, that Christian mindfulness is the practice of paying prayerful attention in the present moment to God's abundant life. And one can read that as meaning that all elements of life are possible places to experience the presence of God. Different people have given different, have expressed different views of why they want to practice mindfulness, why they want to be more mindful. And I've shown these before, but these are just some of the ways that people have expressed it, as simply being more attentive to God's presence, to moving prayer beyond words, to increasing their own sense of love and compassion, creating space to hear God's voice. And these are from the website I mentioned, I think, in the first talk. Some of the ways that people express that. If you find yourself drawn to a practice of silent prayer, you might ask yourself, well, what's my intention here? What's my goal? If you can express it in those terms, it can help you remain motivated. I've mentioned two kinds of mindfulness practice, the first being informal, bringing awareness to everyday activity, and then the second, formal. What I'd like to do today is spend some time on both. First, talking about some informal Christian mindfulness practices, and then I'll ask for thoughts or comments about that. And then we'll do a second experiential session with probably what's the most widely known mindfulness prayer practice or contemplative prayer practice, centering prayer. And Jenny, I think I'm correct in saying that that is a practice that you're quite familiar with or make use of.
Yep.
Okay, so when we get to that point, please add anything you would like to, or if I see you cringing, I'll know that I have said something probably off base. So.
Thank you.
So some informal practices. One of the authors that I like very much, who's written a book recently, it just came out a couple months ago, entitled Embracing the Inconceivable. the God who is utterly beyond thoughts, words, and concepts. And she just said, when we're attentive, every action of everyday life becomes a prayer of presence, opening to God, manifesting, sparkling in and around us. That idea that everything we do can become a prayer. So I'd like to talk about some of those specific ways, in particular, coming back through the day and the use of the breath, walking, eating, and ways to begin and end a day. I believe I've sent Jenny a sheet with some of these on, and actually I've sent her several resource sheets. So anyone who is interested in receiving something in writing, you might want to just contact Jenny at any point before the end of this series. One simple practice is just to take 3 slow, deep breaths. It's very simple. Let your exhalation be a little slower than your inhalation. For some people, it's helpful to, as you inhale, to just silently say, here. And as you exhale, silently say, now. Some people find that a way of bringing themselves back. So I'd like to just take 15 seconds and invite you to do that, to just take 3 slow, deep breaths. And as you do that, perhaps you can feel yourself relaxing a little bit, the muscles relaxing. What that does is, I think in the last talk, I talked about the 2 aspects of the nervous system. The one that activates the fight or flight response, and the other is called the rest and digest system, and that they operate like a seesaw. They go up and down. And what you're doing in that relaxation is activating the rest and digest system. It also brings our attention back to the present. And it can be a reminder that we are held in God's love. And particularly at this time when we're experiencing this unknown respiratory disease, it can be a reminder of the gift of every unlabored breath that we have, every breath being a gift from God. So one very simple habit to develop. And of course, you can use that anytime you think of it in the course of a day. I was nervous before beginning the session today. In fact, I am before any session. So I found myself doing just this, taking 3 deep breaths, sometimes with my eyes open, sometimes closed, just to bring myself back again and again. If you have comments or questions, please use the chat function if you're aware of that. If you don't, I guess, Jenny, would a person just unmute themselves and ask that?
That's the easiest way. If you unmute yourself and then just speak, and then we will hear you. Or if you prefer, you can send a chat and I can ask the question from the chat. So either way works.
Okay. Any comments before, or questions about that before I go on? Pretty simple. Okay, several others. When waking up, just do a mindful check-in. Some people do what's called a body scan. They sort of walk themselves through the length of the body, starting at the head, and just think down, taking note of what you feel, what you experience, bringing your attention to the feelings of the breath. Some people use that time as a moment to be grateful. Thank you, God, for bringing me through another night. Thank you for this breath this morning. Again, just a way of every day getting into that habit of bringing mindful attention to the moment. When you're showering, noticing what comes into the senses, the smell of soap, the sound, the feel of water on your body. Too often, I get done with a shower and I realize that I was not there. I was in my head, thinking about 1,000 things, and I missed the opportunity to fully experience the gift we have of fresh water, of warm water, and the delightful feel of it in a shower. So something as simple as a shower. When preparing food, this is something that I find very, very satisfying. I really enjoy the process of preparing food, of chopping fresh vegetables, peeling them, cutting them up, noticing the colors, noticing the textures, the smell, the feeling in the fingers of a carrot as you peel it. All of these can be activities to bring us back to the present, and again, to be grateful for the incredible abundance of nourishing foods that God has given us. When you're driving, remember that? Remember driving? Some of us do. I can vaguely remember it. When you stop at a red light, using that as an opportunity to perhaps to take some deep breaths. Don't stay there after the light turns green. Remain aware of the colors of the lights, but that also can be an opportunity just to stop, not only the vehicle, but stop ourselves, stop the incessant thought process. Walking is a wonderful opportunity to be mindful, and many contemplative practices use walking disciplines as a way of bringing the attention back to the present. One simple way is simply walk a little slower than you normally do. Some people find it helpful to coordinate their steps while breathing. Some people find it useful to count their breaths while they walk. Perhaps being aware of contact with the earth as your foot sets down and as the foot rolls forward, feeling the contact move from the heel up through the toe of the foot, noticing them. And the slower you walk, the more likely you are to be able to discern this. Some meditative traditions advocate slowing down to where sometimes you might just take a foot's length distance in walking. But anytime you're walking, simply being aware of the movement of the feet and the legs. Many people find walking a labyrinth to be a very meaningful practice. And for those of you who may not be familiar with labyrinths, there's sort of a maze, a circular maze with a path that leads through it in circles, gradually growing down towards the center and then leading back out. And it can be, for many people, it's sort of a moving meditation and a way of symbolizing our path through life. My church, as I think I've mentioned, is St. Stephen's across the street. And there is a labyrinth in the back of St. Stephen's next to the children's playground. And I'm sure that anybody in the community would be welcome to come and walk through that labyrinth. So I would invite you. Jenny, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, can I just add, one of the key differences between a labyrinth and a maze, in a labyrinth, there are no choices to be made, and that you can't, choose which way to go, and you can't come to a dead end. The only choice that you make is whether to enter it or not. And once you enter it, there is one path, and it twists and it turns and it goes to the center and it goes to the outside. But if you continue to follow it, it will lead you to the center. So that's just why it's very relaxing, because there are no decisions to make. You just keep moving forward.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jenny. And what a wonderful metaphor for the silent contemplative practice. No decisions to make. The only decision is whether to enter it. And it's a path that will lead you to the center. So thank you. Thank you for that. So the invitation is there, I think, if anyone would like to try that. I would encourage you, if you do, to go in the daytime. Probably at 3 a.m. would not be the time to be there. The police might have some questions for you, but anytime during the daytime, you're more than welcome. Mindfulness of eating. For most of us, 3 times a day presents a marvelous opportunity to be mindful. And one way to do that is simply to begin slowly, to stop, to breathe, to smile, to slow ourselves down. I try, whenever I sit down before a meal, to just spend 30 seconds looking at it and admiring and enjoying the variety of colors that present themselves. And just like in preparing food, to have an opportunity to give thanks for the abundance that we are given, and to express gratitude for all the people that have brought this to my plate. Slow down while eating. Many of us simply get in the habit of eating quickly and really never savoring each bite. We're looking ahead to the next one. Try to use all your senses, as I mentioned. Let yourself breathe in the scent and enjoy the sight and the textures. Before you begin, notice the experience in your mouth of the saliva starting to build, perhaps a tightening in the stomach as you anticipate a delicious meal, those being the internal sensations. Avoid reading or distracting talk. Most of us enjoy conversation at meals. I certainly do. Sometimes it's nice just to take a meal and agree not to have that, just to focus on the process of eating. Some people find it useful to just set one meal a week aside where you decide, I'm not going to read or have conversation today. I'm just going to focus on the joy of enjoying this food. And throughout, consciously nurture gratitude. And this is a theme that you'll see over and over again in the writings of anyone who does contemplative prayers, that gratitude seems to almost well up as a result of being mindful of the present moment. It just seems to go hand in hand, to give thanks for the gifts that we are given in this present moment. So any comments at this point? Any thoughts about being mindful of eating? Okay. Just continuing, a few other thoughts. Noticing the thoughts and feelings that come up during the day's activities. And it can be especially useful to try to be aware of difficult ones. Times when your anger arises, or judgments of yourself or others, moments of resistance, pushing away the experience of the present, just noticing them. And the key thing is observing them without judging. So many of us have tucked away in the back of our heads a little voice that says, you shouldn't feel this way. And the feelings are just there. The thoughts are there. If we are able to observe them without judging, we'll notice they pass through. They just pass, they pass on. I remember an image I once heard that it is as though in our living room, the door is open and thoughts and feelings come in the front door, and there they are. If we don't notice them, or rather if we notice them and just just nod that they're there, eventually they'll just walk back out the front door. If we try to push them away, they go down in the basement and they lift weights. They get stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's so key, to just observe them. For many people, brief prayer practices through the course of the day are ways of coming back to the present. These are several that I've known people to use. Certainly, thy will be done, we know well, and fear not, both biblical, appear over and over again in the Bible. And just thank you again and again. There was a book that came out a few years ago. I think probably many of you are familiar with it, that just talked about three phrases, and I'll get them wrong, I think. Help, thanks, and wow, I think was the title of the book. You know, 3 key aspects of prayer. So just brief prayer practices. I'll just ask, has anyone found brief prayer practices, brief phrases that they use through the course of the day to be useful? Anybody, feel free to, yeah, Jenny.
I didn't need to say anything, but just say that, yeah, breath prayer with those phrases can be very, very helpful for me. And then it's there. So then that phrase is there. So when I really need it, it seems to well up spontaneously.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have comments from your own experience? What has been helpful to you in terms of brief prayer practices, brief phrases through the course of a day? Okay.
When I go outside, I use the thank you a lot. Just, this has been a glorious spring, and I'll just look around and all the different blooms. I would just say, thank you, God, and just make a list. I mean, I would just say every flower that was blooming, and that just seems to help. Or I live in the country, so every animal that I see, I'll say thank you. Because I don't do that a whole lot. So, during this time especially, it has really helped me a lot.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I can't see everyone's picture on the frame, so I'm not sure.
Oh, it's Kathy. It's Kathy.
Thank you, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Okay. I think, and again, just underscoring, many people find that ending the day by consciously reviewing the day, some people find it useful to try to think of 3 things for which they were grateful for the day. And even for people who are going through very difficult times, it can be a time of saying, I am grateful for that pain was a little less today. I'm grateful for a conversation I had today with someone who cares about me. Whatever it might be, I'm grateful for being able to breathe without the experience right now of being sick with the virus. So just finding opportunities for gratitude. Like Kathy, as you obviously are making use of your experience outside and the flowers, finding ways to be thankful. I'm going to close this part of our time together with this little cartoon from Mutz. Which I like, just always coming back to now, which for this little dog is always her favorite time. So I'm going to shift gears at this point, and we've been talking about informal methods of contemplative prayer, and I'll shift into the second formal method. Before we make that shift, does anybody have comments that you want to make? Okay. So this will be our second formal practice. It's the practice of centering prayer. And I think I mentioned this is probably the most widely known, particularly in this country. It was developed at a Trappist monastery in Massachusetts by 3 monks in the mid-70s, Thomas Keating being the best known of the 3. From what I've heard him say is that they looked around in the mid-70s and they saw a lot of young people, in essence, walking past their abbey on their way to doing meditative practices with Buddhists and Hindu teachers. And they looked at each other and said, well, wait a minute, we have a rich tradition here in the Christian tradition. Let's offer this to people. And they of course were familiar with all with much of the contemplative literature. And there's one text entitled The Cloud of Unknowing. It was written in the 14th century by an anonymous Englishman, probably a monk. And it outlined a practice of contemplative prayer, silent prayer, that it described as a way of cultivating a deeper relationship with God. It's also described as a method of resting in God beyond thoughts, words, and emotions. Thomas Keating in particular has written widely on that. Thomas Keating died a couple of years ago, well up into his 90s. And I'll show a couple of if you're interested, if you find yourself interested in centering prayer, I have some references that you might find interesting for him. Before we get into the exercise itself and what we do, Jenny in particular, since you have familiarity with this, is there anything you would like to say about the practice of centering prayer?
Not yet, so why don't you go ahead and explain it? And yeah, but just to remind people that we do, when the church is open, which is not now, but eventually it will be open again, we do have a group that meets each Tuesday at 12 o'clock in the chapel. It's very interesting. Centering prayer is quiet, you don't speak, and yet it feels different when you do it alone and when you do it in a group. Yes. So it's one of those things that I don't have a good explanation, but it's certainly true. So I would invite anyone who would like to participate to come to that.
Thank you. Thank you. I know several people from several different churches in Oak Ridge who I believe attend your group. So it's meeting a lot of needs there. So what the practice is to first choose a sacred word, and that can be personal. And the use of that word is as a symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. And this is taken from the Centering Prayer website. These are their guidelines. I'm giving you a very quick summary, and we'll talk specifically about what we'll do in our 5-minute sit. Centering Prayer also offers, I believe, a 3 to 6 hour training that's given periodically around the country. So this is a real quick tour of it. The sacred word is, remember last week we used a technique called Christian meditation, where we had a particular word that's repeated throughout the session, and that word was Maranatha, and we used the four syllables spoken in conjunction with the breath as a way of coming back and focusing attention and bringing it back. Centering prayer is a little different. The sacred word, and each person selects one of their own that that resonates for them, and it's more a symbol rather than a tangible anchor. Then you silently introduce that sacred word as you sit. You sit comfortably with your eyes closed. And when thoughts come, you return gently to the sacred word. So the word is not repeated throughout the prayer period. It's simply used as a way to come back again and again to silently sitting in God's presence. One way they describe it is that Thomas Keating has described it. He just said, thoughts come along like boats on the river. You sit on the side and you watch the boats go by. But when you find yourself having jumped onto one of the boats, that's when you use your sacred word to bring yourself back to the bank. So it's a little different from Christian meditation that we talked about last week, we practiced last week. So that's a thumbnail sketch. Jenny, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just 2 things. So the sacred word, they take that from, as Steve mentioned, the cloud of unknowing. And ideally, that word is very short. They encourage 1 or 2 syllables, but again, it's very personal. I mean, it could be Jesus, it can be God, or it could be peace or light or whatever. So it should be simple. The other thing is, for some people, they're not word oriented, but another possibility is, instead of a sacred word, is an image in your mind, whether that's the sun or whatever. But again, it doesn't matter so much whether it's a word or what that word is or the image. But as Steve said, the purpose of that is not to repeat it like a mantra, but as a way to remind you and to get you back into the experience of God's presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Anyone else have thoughts about this, perhaps from your own experience? Okay.
Just, can I share one other cute story from Thomas Keating? He was giving a workshop and somebody came to him afterwards and said, I'm just terrible at this. And he said, well, what do you mean? Because she said, 1,000 times in that 20 minutes, my mind drifted off. And he quickly said, how beautiful, 1,000 times to choose to go back into God's presence. So the idea is not, with the non-judgmental, to blame that you're not good. That's not the point. And the point isn't to necessarily bliss out. The point is to give this time and to consciously be choosing to try and be in God's presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. What a beautiful reframing of the practice that we all go through, which is the mind taking off, the thoughts taking off, to reframe those as opportunities to come back again and again to God's presence. So Any questions before we try this for a 5-minute sit? What I'd invite you to do is just take a moment and think for yourself of a sacred word, or as Jenny said, a sacred image, a short word, an image that you'll use during this 5-minute sit. And when you have that, sit comfortably with your eyes closed. I suggest sitting upright to the extent that you're able. It helps keep one from dozing, which is easy to do. And I will begin us with 3 bells, and then there'll be 5 minutes of silence, and then ending with 3 bells. And at the end of that time, just slowly allow your eyes to open, and we'll come back, and then I'll ask if anyone would like to share anything they experience. So we'll begin. So just allow your eyes to slowly open and come back to this place, to this time. I'm going to shift out of share mode so that, Jenny, if I'm in the share mode, does that mean that everybody can only see a few people? Okay, let me shift out for a moment and see if anybody has anything that they would like to get on about that experience. Anything you would like to share? What was that like? What did you notice?
It was very calming.
Very calming.
Mhm.
This is Kathy. I sat with my palms on my lap with my palms upward.
Mhm.
And it was very relaxing, peaceful. And I also had the image of being in the chapel at church with others around. And the chapel is a very intimate, a small setting. And that was very, very peaceful.
Was there a significance to having your hands with the palms upward? Did that have significance for you?
Yes, at first I had my palms turned downward on my desk, and it just felt, I felt more open, if you will, by having my palms on my lap, facing upwards.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, I felt more open.
Thank you, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? If I can share something from my own experience, as soon as it started, a bird started singing outside my window. And my first reaction was irritation, because it was taking me away from my silence. And I had this, what flashed through my mind was saying to God, well, I tried to do silent prayer, but this bird kept getting in the way, and God laughing and saying, where did you think I was, Steve? I'm speaking to you through everything around you, through all of my creation. So I think that comes back again to being gentle with ourselves. Anyone else before we kind of wrap up here? Okay, I'll shift back to the screen share mode and we'll close up. So just a couple of resources if you're interested in centering prayer. Their website is www.contemplativeoutreach.org. A lot of good resources on that website, including in much more detail the actual process of centering prayer, how you go about it. A number of good books by Thomas Keating and a woman, actually an Episcopal priest who works with him, Cynthia Bourgeot. I think often a good starting book is Open Mind, Open Heart by Thomas Keating. I see Jenny turning, and I'm wondering if perhaps she has a copy of that. Certainly, Jenny is a wonderful resource for you. And if any of you are interested in pursuing this further, I think we're going to have an opportunity of seeing some. Okay, there is Open Mind, Open Heart.
Honestly, I think Cynthia Bourgeot's book Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening, I think is the best introduction to the practice and the experience.
Mm.
Thomas Keating's book are much more theoretical, and talk about just sort of why it works and how it works and all of that. But as far as the simple practice, I think Cynthia's book, in my opinion, is, I mean, they're both great, but just a little bit different.
If people are interested in giving Centering Prayer a try, Jenny, would you be, could they contact you for?
Of course. Yep. I love this stuff. So I'm
There
happy
you
to
go.
talk about it and share it with anybody.
There you go. Many people find that they commit themselves to starting just a few minutes each day, perhaps 5 minutes. Many people find over time that their period of contemplative prayer gets longer. Some people find it helpful to pick a particular time during the day to do that, often in the early morning. You know, whatever works for you. The key thing is doing it. I heard one speaker talking about contemplative prayer who said, centering, or rather contemplative prayer will have absolutely no effect on you unless you do it. There you go.
Jenny, what's the name of the book by Cynthia, whatever her name is?
Cynthia Bourgeot, Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening.
Centering Prayer and Inner
Awakening.
Okay, thank you.
There you
And
go.
actually there's an R in her. It's Bourgeault.
Ah, thank you. I'll have to speak to my my slide person. So, if for some of you who might have access to Amazon Prime, there is what I thought was a very interesting documentary on the life of Thomas Keating entitled "A Rising Tide of Silence." If you have Amazon Prime, I think there's no cost with that documentary. It's an hour and 15 minutes. He's a very interesting person, and I found that very interesting, if that's of interest to you. So that it's 2:03. We've gone over a little bit. Next week, we'll do a couple of things. I'll present a third formal practice. And next week, I'd like to do that first, because then there's some ways I'd like to sort of try to pull things together before we close. That practice is Christian Zen. And that obviously comes out of the Japanese Zen tradition brought to this country by Jesuit priests. And we'll talk about general guidelines for Christian meditation that sort of encompass all three of the techniques we've discussed here, or will have discussed, as well as others. I'd like to present a model that pulls together both health-based mindfulness and Christian mindfulness, and then just talk about some additional resources. So, any comments, thoughts about next week? Okay, so I'd like to close us the way we have the last two times. And Jenny, I think I've asked if you would be willing to lead us in this prayer form.
Sure, be happy to.
Thank
So
you.
let us rest and receive this prayer. May I know God's love. May I know God's joy. May I know God's peace. May we know God's love. May we know God's joy. May we know God's peace. May all persons know God's love. May all persons know God's joy. May all persons know God's peace. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. May you all be healthy and safe through the coming week. Hope to see you next week.